when you are participating in these events, you can't get by with just doing like an hour or 45 minutes or even 90 minutes of high intensity work and then that's it. You have to build into your plan. Hi, welcome to the Judy Torel Show, where I explore topics intended to optimize every body 50, 60, 70, and above. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Judy Torel Show. So if you're joining me on this episode, you are in my 6th series podcast with the theme of how to build and execute a training plan if you are over 60 years old and you are an endurance athlete. All right, so this is episode number 3. I have covered in the first of this series, like the parameters that I'm talking about, the terms that we're talking about, the principles and the concepts that need to be addressed. In the second series, or the second episode, of the series, I talked about how over 60-year-olds really still need to do the high-end trainings because that's the first thing that goes as we're getting older. So you need to put those into your training plan first and how to do that. And now in this episode, I'm going to talk about once you've got those high-end trainings kind of in place, how do you build in your actual endurance work? And when you're over 60 years old, the science and the literature is indicating that there's a law of diminishing returns. And so to do the longer, slower, or more moderate, or even higher end, but long duration workouts is contraindicated for 60-year-olds and older. However, if you are an endurance athlete who's still 60 years old and older, you're participating in, marathons or ultra marathons still, or you're participating in half Ironman or above that duration events. You're a cyclist that's going 3 hours or more in events. You're a distance swimmer participating in swims that are over those, over 2 miles. Then you are somebody who has to build in these longer duration workouts, even though they are less effective as we get older than these shorter ones that are more intense. All right. So again, I am a 60-year-old athlete myself. I am still participating in Ironman distance triathlons. As a matter of fact, in about 4 weeks, I have my 11th one that I'll be participating in and racing. And so I have my own experience in observing what I need to do for my body. I keep my finger on the pulse of the literature that comes out for our age group and peer group on this topic. And so there you go. That's why I'm posting this series. And the other thing is I coach individuals who are 60s and 70s. And as a matter of fact, I want to add, I haven't said this in the series yet, I have 2 people, one a female and one a male, who have both qualified for World's Ironman long distance triathlon in Kona, and they both qualified through my coaching and their effort when they were in their one. The woman is 69, the male when he qualified and finished. The woman is participating this year in Worlds in October, next year in October, but he was 71. So again, like I've got experience coaching people, I've got experiencing myself as a 60-year-old athlete, ultra endurance and endurance athlete, and I stay ahead of the literature. So all that said, backdrop. So now this episode, I'm talking about, when you are participating in these events, you can't get by with just doing like an hour or 45 minutes or even 90 minutes of high intensity work, and then that's it. You have to build into your plan, depending on what your event and your race duration is. But, for an Ironman, for me, I got to build in bikes that are 100 miles, 112 miles, bricks that are combining, at least an 80-mile bike with, at least a 4 to 8 mile run. So we're talking about, 4 to 6 hour duration trainings, and you can't not do them and just do the higher end stuff and come to your event and expect to, have the endurance and have the experience with the nutrition that you have to be practicing when you're doing these trainings also. But that's a whole nother topic. But you have to have the, 6 hour, 4 hour, 5 hour, 6 hour trainings under your belt. And if it's contraindicated when you're over 60 to do the duration stuff, but it's what's necessary for your sport, and you recognize you have to put in the higher intensity stuff because that's the first stuff that goes, and you're laying out your plan and you got that in. Now, how much and to what intensity should you be doing the longer duration trainings? So for this episode, I'm going to say to you, when I observe my coached clients that have been 60 and 70 and where they fail, is what happens is I will put into their plan their longer duration workouts, 3, 4, 5 hours, let's just say. And when they go to do them, they are doing them at too high of a training intensity. And when you're then mixing that with your high-end intensity, shorter trainings in a, 10 to 14 day training block, and again, I addressed that in the second episode of this series. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to that one. Then what happens is they want to go out, they go out too hard and too intensely for the longer duration workouts. Their higher end workouts then aren't as high of a level as that they need them to be. And everything kind of goes into what's called homogenizing to the mean. And what that means is you're not getting the benefits of the high-end training because they become moderate training because you're not recovered enough. And your longer duration things are done at too high of a level. So they are negating the high intensity stuff and the whole thing. So it feels like you're really busting your butt doing these trainings when in reality, the work output that you're doing for the heart rate and the respiratory rate and the, training intensity that you're doing is actually lower total work, but it feels like it's higher total work because you just don't have the recovery time. That's the problem. So what then usually happens is, again, observing my clients that have been in their 60s and 70s, is that they'll go out too high intensity on the longer duration, and then they can't or they don't want to do the higher intensity stuff, and then that they either don't do those or they do them but at a level that's the same as their long duration stuff, and you're just kind of stuck in a gradually declining state of fitness, even though it feels like you're busting your butt. All right, so to avoid that, we got to get those high-end ones in there, and then you're going to build in, the longer duration ones once you've had the higher intensity ones already programmed. That's one major shift that is not what most of my over 60 clients that are doing endurance athlete events do. They put the long stuff in there and then try to do the high-end stuff, and then they generally fail to do that because they're too tired. They don't have enough recovery. So I'm telling you, put the higher end stuff in your 10 to 14 day, training block, and then you're going to build in your longer duration trainings. Now, you got to do them at a level of intensity that is like the lower to middle of your aerobic zone. All right. You're going to want to go out and do them at a higher level, but because they're long, even though you're not doing them at the highest intensity of the high intensity workouts, you want to feel like you're doing a really good workout. And so the tendency is to over push that and be, on the upper end of level 3 zone or, flirting with that anaerobic threshold for periods during that training. You don't want to do that. You got to go out for your long ones, and you got to stay in that window where you're like, I'm in what I call the Goldilocks zone. And the Goldilocks zone means it's like the just right zone. It's not too easy. It's not too hard. And it's kind of like your go all day zone. As long as you're fueling and taking in fluid, electrolytes, and fuel, carbohydrate, then you could be able to go at that level, like almost like unlimited. So that's like your lower end of zone 3, upper end zone 2. But if you're not into the zones and the heart rates or the wattage output or whatever the metrics are for measuring the intensities, then what I'm going to tell you is you should not be breathless. You should be in comfortable breathing. I like to use breathing because you can always tell. Like you don't even need a device. You can just like pay attention. If you should be in I'm breathing, I'm working, but I'm in the Goldilocks zone. Goldilocks is the just right zone. I'm not pushing and I'm not, lollygagging. Like I'm right in that sweet spot zone. That's the level of intensity your long duration training should be at. So that's mistake number one that most of my over 60s are doing. They're going at that too high. And then the second mistake is you can only, again, even though you're in these lower kind of like output zones, I don't want to say lower, that's misleading. They're like moderate output of the work zone, low end of the work zone, moderate output in the total work output. But they're long. And so they do need a recovery time coming out of them, even though they're not as intense as your higher intensity workouts with your intervals and where you are pushing your heart rate and your breathing rate into breathless and you need the recovery from those. The longer duration ones that are like low to moderate output of the work zone, you still need recovery from. And so you can't put too many of these in your training plan either. So if you've got your high intensity ones in there, like on a 10 to 14 day training plan for a 60 plus person who's an endurance athlete, I would say to you that you would want to put, what I like to do is I'll put like maybe 2 of the longer duration workouts that are close to your, that you're building to, or, towards your total output for your race, whatever that is. But you're only going to do like 2 of those in a 10 to 14 day cycle. And then the next 10 to 14 day cycle, like I would reduce that down to 1. So you're still getting them in, but you're not doing them as frequently as you would have when you were like in your 50s or 40s. Because they also need recovery time when you're over 60, not necessarily from a joint perspective, not necessarily from a, high intensity output perspective, but there's a metabolic effect from staying in a long, duration training at a lower level that when you're over 60, your body needs. So you can't string together like 3 or 4 in a row or within a 10 to 14 day training block that are in the low level and say, well, they're lower level, so I should be able to do these if they're over 3 hours. Like you've got to titrate those in a less frequent but still consistent way. And, in my second episode, I talked about, for a 60 plus endurance athlete, a 7-day training block is too short of a time because we need more recovery time. So I tend to use a 10 to 14 day training block when I'm putting in all the components that my athletes and myself need to be an over 60 endurance athlete and still be building in active recovery time or full recovery time where you can get all the high intensity workouts you need, get the longer duration workouts you need, and still have the active recovery time so that you can then start the next block and see improvement. All right, so to reiterate, as over 60-year-old endurance athletes, we still need to do these longer duration trainings that are building us up to the duration of our targeted events. We can't let those go to the wayside. If I'm training somebody who's not actually participating in these events and these races, then I'm going to let those longer ones go, and I'm going to give them more of the intense ones with more moderate duration ones peppered in. But we need the longer ones as the endurance athletes. So you need to keep them in, even though as we age, that's the first thing that's recommended to come pull back on. But you need to build in your higher intensity workouts first, and then put in 2 or 3, not more than that, in a 14-day block, and then reduce that down to 1 or 2 for the next 14-day block, and then kind of like toggle between those for a training plan. Because too many of these longer duration ones is going to be as undermining as too many of the high intensity ones when you're over 60. And then the second point for this episode is that when you're doing those long ones, you don't want to try and push the ticket. You want to stay in the Goldilocks zone when they're over 3 hours. All right. So there's my, what do you need? How do you pepper in the long duration workouts for your endurance athletes? In conjunction with your high intensity ones. So that's episode number 3. And now episode number 4, I'm going to be talking about another topic related to what our endurance athletes need when you're over 60 to stay on top of your game, still participate in your events, but you got to tune in to find out what that is. So as always, everybody, my theme for all my podcasts is that I want to help people make their second 50 years better than their first 50 years. That's my goal and agenda. And, I hope that you stay with me for the next 3 episodes in this series, because there's pearls of wisdom if you are a over 60 endurance athlete. Okay, everybody, be well. Thanks for listening, everybody. And if you'd like to have access to some of my additional resources, I can be found at Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on my website, www.judytorel.com.